Thank you for joining us and listening to this message from the Ministry of Grace Providence Church in Cerritos, California. For more information, visit our website at www.graceprovidencechurch.org.
Let's turn to the book of Esther, and I'm going to tell the story again of the whole book as briefly as I can. So this is a sermon on God's providence as illustrated in this book. Providence is something that people don't even talk much about. The word isn't used today very much. But when we're talking about providence, we're talking about God's hand in human history, in our lives, in the affairs of this world, that He's working behind the scenes, sometimes very invisibly, as He is in this book, and then sometimes it manifests, shows itself in a powerful way, and then we're struck by it when it's unusual. And we have both in the book of Esther. I'm going to read just two of the chapters, chapters 6 and 7. Chapter 6 and verse 1. That night the king had trouble sleeping, so he ordered an attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign so that it could be read to him. In those records he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the eunuchs who guarded the door to the king's private quarters. They had plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. The king speaking now. What reward or recognition did we ever give to Mordecai for this? The king added. His attendants replied, nothing has been done for him. Who is that in the outer court? The king inquired. As it happened, Haman had just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole he had prepared. So the attendants replied to the king, Haman is out in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. So Haman came in, and the king said, what should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? Haman thought to himself, whom would the king wish to honor more than me? So he replied, if the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with a royal emblem on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horse. Have the officials shout as they go, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. Excellent, the king said to Haman. Quick, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew. Now, when I retell the story, you're going to get the full irony of this. Who sits at the gate of the palace, leave out nothing you have suggested. So Haman took the robes, he put them on Mordecai, he placed him on the king's own horse, and he led him through the city square shouting, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the palace gate, but Haman hurried home dejected and completely humiliated. When Haman told his wife, Zeresh, and all his friends what had happened, his wise advisors and his wife said, since Mordecai, this man who has humiliated you, is of Jewish birth, you will never succeed in your plans against him. It will be fatal to continue opposing him. While they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and quickly took Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared. Chapter 7. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. And on this second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? And I will give it to you, even if it is half of the kingdom." Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor with the king, and it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king." "Who would do such a thing?" King Xerxes demanded. "Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you?" Esther replied, "This wicked Haman is our adversary and enemy." Haman grew pale with fright before the king and the queen. Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage, and he went out onto the palace garden. Haman, however, he stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. And in despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining. And just as the king was returning from the palace garden, the king exclaimed, "Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?" And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, "Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination." "Then impale Haman on it," the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole that he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Now, it would have been good if we could have read the whole book. But I've selected those chapters because that's where the great climax comes and the irony of the story. So the book of Esther, obviously, is a historical account. It's a narrative of historical events that occurred in the court of a Persian monarch by the name of Xerxes I, or in another translation, Ahasuerus, as it is in Hebrew, speaking of the same individual. Now, it gives you some ideas where this king fits in. The date of his reign is about 20 years, 486 to 465 BC. There was Cyrus the Great, then Darius the Mede, and then Xerxes. He's the son of Darius. And his mother was the daughter of Cyrus. So these kings are all connected. This man's son or descendant is Artaxerxes, who you will read about in one of the other books. So you give us some idea of the order of these men and where they were. So we're looking at events in the Persian Empire in a fortress city called Susa. That's in modern-day Iran. The remains are still there. It was a very prominent, very important city in the ancient world. So this is a very dramatic story and I try to read it with some drama so that you'd be able to follow it. Basically, it's about the deliverance of the Jews from annihilation. So here is the original attempt to exterminate these people by Haman. Now, what is interesting about this story is that the name of God never appears in this book. Not one time. But he is implied a few different times. And let me tell you the instances in which he is implied and recognized. The fact that Mordecai refuses to bow to Haman, and we'll come to that in a moment. Mordecai is a Jew. He refuses to bow to Haman and to pay him respect, probably out of obedience to the Mosaic law. You're not to bow down to idols, to men, to those that are set forth as someone very special. God is also implied when Esther calls upon her friends and Mordecai to fast for them, for her, on her behalf, before she goes in to see the king. Well, why fast? This is a religious exercise. It implies there's a reason. She's trying to obtain God's favor, God's intervention, without saying it. And also, when Haman's wife and his friends warn him that you cannot succeed opposing Mordecai the Jew, why would they say that? Why would they think that? Because these heathen people, they understood there was something about the Jewish people that had God's protection. Do not touch my chosen people, Psalm 105. And that went out even into the heathen world, who they were. That they enjoyed some sort of divine favor and protection. So in my view, God is implied in those things. But we're going to see God's hand, actually, in the story. So first of all, I want you to, as we think our way through the providence of God in this book, notice first of all, notice the providence of God in ordinary events. And these events form a chain, an unbroken chain, in order to accomplish some purpose that God has. Now, to give the big picture of the book of Esther is this. God's plan is to bring his people to the brink of destruction, to bring them into danger, to the very brink of destruction, and then deliver them with a great deliverance that glorifies himself. Now, how does he do that? Okay, let's think through the book. Okay, chapter by chapter. Chapter 1 tells us that this King Xerxes decided to throw a big banquet. Now, he reigned over a huge empire all the way from India to Ethiopia. Now, when it talks about Ethiopia, it's not the little country of Africa that you're thinking of. It means all of the continent below Egypt was considered Cush, or Ethiopia. This is the extent of Xerxes' empire. It consisted of 127 provinces, we're told, in the opening verses of chapter 1. So what he did, he invited all his dignitaries, all the officials, governors throughout his empire. He invited them to Susa, and he put on this banquet that went for almost a half a year. It was amazing. Now, what he does in this banquet, he wants to show off his wife, Queen Vashti. She's a beautiful woman, Queen Vashti. He ordered Vashti to come to this banquet with wearing her royal crown as the queen, and he wanted to put her on display and show how beautiful the queen was. Well, you know what she did? She said, no, I'm not going to do that. She refused. Because of her disobedience, the king was advised by his cabinet, you need to get another queen. And she was banished, she was deposed. That was it for insubordination. That's the end of Queen Vashti. That's the contents of chapter 1. Now, chapter 2. So now what are they going to do to get another queen? Well, they have an idea. They tell the king, we want to search throughout your empire for the most beautiful young women. And we'll bring them together and we're going to have a beauty contest to find out which one the king wants as his replacement for Queen Vashti. So Esther, who the book is named after, or her Hebrew name, Hadassah, she's included among the women that were selected in the empire. Now, she happens to live in Susa. She's there. And she is with her cousin Mordecai. Now, Mordecai, the Jew, his family came into the Persian Empire way back when King Nebuchadnezzar took captives from Jerusalem and brought them to Babylon. And his family was part of that original captivity. That's how Mordecai ended up in the Persian Empire. Well, this woman, Esther, was actually his cousin, and her parents died. And so Mordecai adopted her as his own and raised her. So this is the connection between these two people in the story. So Esther is Jewish, along with her cousin Mordecai. So going on with chapter 2, Esther finds favor with King Xerxes. She's the one. And she had about a year of spa treatments, to put it in modern language. This is what they did for her. A year's worth. She's the one that King Xerxes wants. He loves her. He makes her the queen of the empire. We don't know how old she is. Very young, beautiful. But Mordecai advised her, don't reveal your heritage. Don't let anybody know that you're Jewish. And so she kept that a secret. However, Mordecai made his Jewishness known, but not Esther. Now, also in chapter 2, the chapter ends with something that happened. Mordecai has a position at the gate, the king's gate, an important place. And he overhears a couple of the king's guards talking, and he uncovers that they are plotting to kill King Xerxes. So Mordecai makes Queen Esther aware of what they're planning. Esther tells the king, they investigate the matter and they found it to be true, and both of these men are put to death. But that's as far as it goes. Nothing was done for Mordecai. No, he wasn't rewarded. Nothing. But what he did is recorded in these chronicles, these records of the Persian Empire that the royal court had. So in chapter 3, then, we come across this fellow named Haman. And he is exalted by King Xerxes. He's raised up and he's given a promotion in the empire. We don't know exactly the nature of his promotion, but it could have been something close to being the prime minister, for whatever reason. And so he as he's passing through, everybody is recognizing how great Haman is. And they're bowing and they're just showing all kinds of respect. But Mordecai refuses to bow to Haman. He doesn't want to bow before him. This infuriates Haman. And he goes home and he tells his family, and they advise him that he should do something about this. And so Haman concocts a plan to not only kill Mordecai, but to kill all the Jews. This is how he's going to get rid of the problem. He's going to take care of all of them in the empire. And he takes his plan to King Xerxes and he presents it to him, but he doesn't tell Xerxes who these people are. He never says that they're Jewish. He simply says, there is a people in the empire that are different from everybody else. They separate themselves, they have different laws, and they don't follow the king's orders. Now, Mordecai actually disobeyed King Xerxes by not bowing to Haman. He was supposed to bow to Haman according to what the king had ordered. So, King Xerxes follows Haman's suggestion. He makes a decree to have these people eradicated from the empire. Haman casts lots to find out what day and month of the year he had to have that in place, so actually that occurred first. He cast lots to find out the time of this day in history when the Jewish people are going to be annihilated from the Persian Empire. And that day fell on March 7th, 473 BC. It was about a year later from the time the lots were cast, so it put it way off into the future. So the king issues this decree. The decree is sent out throughout the empire. Everyone is made aware of it. And Mordecai finds out this news. It hits him hard. He is in mourning over it. And he finally communicates, this is now chapter 4, he communicates to Esther what has happened. And she knows that she needs to do something, so she says, "Please fast on my behalf." She tells Mordecai through another individual that was helping with the communication, "This is going to be risky for me to go before the king. I have not seen him for a whole month, 30 days. And I could lose my life if I go to him without an invitation." But she decides to go after a 3-day fast in her behalf and comes before the king. Now, chapter 5. So what happens in the 5th chapter? She comes in dressed in her royal garments as the queen. And she stands at the door of where the king is seated on his throne, and he extends the scepter to her. He graciously welcomes Queen Esther into his presence. He says, "Queen Esther, what is it you want?" And her first request is, "I want to have you and Haman come to a banquet today." So that happens. The king and Haman come to her banquet that very day. And at that banquet, the king asks, "Well, what is it you really want?" "I want you and Haman to come tomorrow to my feast. And then I'll tell you what this is about." Haman's response to this in the 5th chapter he became very happy. Boy, he's feeling so privileged that Queen Esther not only invited the king, but invited him to her banquet, her special meal. And he goes out and he happens to see Mordecai on his way out. And Mordecai refuses to bow and he gets angry, but he controls himself. And he gets home and he's bragging to his wife and his friends how all this good fortune that's come his way. And they advise him, his wife advises him along with his friends, you know what you ought to do? You need to set up a pole. Now in the other translation says gallows. Like you think of a gallows with a rope that he's going to be hung. That's not what it is. It's talking about a piece of wood. Very tall, because in the Persian way of executing people in the ancient world was to impale them, not hang them on a rope. The Egyptians did it as well. In fact, the word that is used in the Greek translation of Esther for that is the word crucify. To crucify him, impale him on this piece of wood. Very tall. And they tell him that in the morning, notice this. This is their counsel to Mordecai, to Haman. Have him killed in the morning before you go to this banquet. That way you just eliminate Mordecai. You don't have to think about him anymore. Hey, go on your merry way and just have a great time at this banquet. Chapter 6. So that night, you see that? Verse 1. That night, before the banquet the next day, the king Xerxes has insomnia. He can't sleep. Gets up in the middle of the night, instead of asking to play a game or something like that, he says, bring those chronicles, the records of the Persian Empire. Bring those books and read them to me. And they, of all the places they could have read, they read about the previous thing in this story about Mordecai saving the king's life by exposing this assassination attempt that was recorded in those books. And he said, did we ever do anything for Mordecai to honor him and reward him for this? They said, no. Then we're going to do something about that. At that moment, as the king is thinking through all this, somebody comes that morning. Now it's early morning. Somebody comes into the court. It's Haman. Haman came. Haman was intending to ask the king to impale Mordecai. That morning, he was going to get rid of him. And so the king, he's thinking about the reward for Mordecai. And without naming him, without saying who it's about, he says, he's asking Haman this now. What should we do for the person that the king wishes to honor? And Haman's thinking to himself, well, who would the king want to honor more than me? So we read it, all the things that he suggested. That's an excellent idea. Now I want you to do this for Mordecai. This is just too good. The irony of this. He had a misunderstanding who it was about simply because King Xerxes did not tell who it was for. He withheld that information. So you can imagine the humiliation of Haman. You just can't imagine. Having to parade this person through the streets, calling out, bringing honor to Mordecai. So in chapter 7 then, we have Esther's banquet, and Esther's now her third request And the king really wants to find out what she wanted to talk about. And then she uncovers this plot to exterminate all her people, including herself. Imagine how that must have hit Haman when he realized the queen is Jewish. So he ends up being executed. He appeared to assault the queen when the king left in a rage. Chapter 8, we have her fourth request, which is that the king would make another decree. Now, we all know that phrase, the law of the Medes and the Persians. It was fixed. You can't change a law of the Medes and the Persians. So that original decree of Haman, that was the law of the Medes and the Persians. It was signed with the signet ring of King Xerxes. So that day, March 7th, had to happen, that the Jews were going to face extermination. So Queen Esther's idea is, king, make another decree for the same day, permitting the Jewish people to defend themselves and to kill anyone who might even think about assaulting them. And she followed up, and do it again the next day, March 7th and 8th, back to back, 2 days. And we read about the results. There were 500 people in the city of Susa that were eliminated, their enemies, along with the 10 sons of Haman. 300 the next day, 75,000 throughout the whole empire. And that became then the basis for the celebration of the Feast of Purim. Celebrated even today, late winter time, either in February or March every year, a 2-day celebration. One of great joy over the deliverance of the Jewish people. Okay. Now, I know that took a long time to go through. Let me try to pass quickly to this. Let me just ask. So, this is a chain of events. A chain of events, and what I mean by that is that these events are all connected. They are linked together. And they're contingent, dependent on each other. It's like dominoes. The falling of dominoes. You hit one domino and then all the dominoes fall over. In other words, if you take out one of these links in this plan, the plan is not going to be accomplished. It's very important that all the things have to happen. For example, right at the beginning, suppose King Xerxes did not have this banquet. What would happen? We would not have this story. So the very first thing you read about is important to the rest of the events. That banquet had to happen. Suppose he did not banish Queen Vashti. Suppose he loved her so much that even though she disobeyed him, he wasn't going to get rid of his wife and the queen. Again, the story would collapse. Every event in this chain of events is important to the next. Now, why am I making a point of that? Because this is the way our life is as well. Now, it doesn't seem like, I don't really see how the things in my life are connected, but they are. Romans 8:28 tells us this. When Paul says that all things work together for good, that word work together, sunergeo, means that all the events of our life are working in concert, in harmony, in unison. They're in cooperation with God's plan. This is important because, listen to this, what I'm going to tell you. We make a mistake when we take one event out of that chain in our life. Take one link out of the chain and hold it up and then start looking at it. And then try to interpret it. Trying to understand it. Questioning it. Why did this happen? I don't get this. This doesn't seem fair or right to me. No, we will come up with a false conclusion, a false interpretation, a false understanding of God's plan. The events in our life are not meant to be taken out of context and isolated and evaluated on their own. Because everything is interconnected. Things are working together. And what is the end? What is God's plan? What does Paul say? All things work together for good to those that love God. So we take out one event and say, well, this doesn't look like it's good. How does this one thing do good? It's evil. It's bad. It almost destroyed me. No, you got to put it with the other things, before it and after it. It's so important, brethren, to look at your life like that. And this is a good illustration of how that works. Here we have just such a wonderful example how everything is interconnected. But even though our life doesn't seem to be as pronouncedly interconnected and contingent upon each event, I believe it is. And we can draw a better understanding of God's work in us, given that everything is working in cooperation and harmony. Okay, now secondly, the second thing about providence, I got to move quickly. Second thing about providence is the timing of events. The timing. This is so striking. The timing. Mordecai even suggests this to the queen, to Queen Esther, when he says to her in chapter 4, "Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this?" So Esther becoming queen at this particular time in Jewish history was important to the story. The day and the month that was decided by casting lots. This was Haman. He cast lots. This was by chance that it fell on March 7th. Well, that was in April when he did that of the previous year. So it gave him almost a whole year before the day that the Jews were going to be slaughtered. 11 months later. You know why that's so important? Because it gave them a lot of time to prepare for it. And for all these other events to happen. If the day had been a few weeks later, let's say, we wouldn't have the story that we have to look at. And then take the night that the king had insomnia. Suppose he had slept that night. Had a beautiful night's sleep. No problem, sleeping. He slept through the night. Haman comes the next day, wants to impale Mordecai. Again, a completely different story. But he couldn't sleep. I want to hear those records read to me. And then the crown of the timing is at the moment the king wanted to honor Mordecai after that night of restlessness and listening to, being read to. Haman comes in. I mean, the timing of that. It was perfect. Perfect timing. You know, brethren, God often tests us with His timing. We're tested in our faith and patience. This is why the Old Testament especially emphasizes to wait on the Lord. God is never early. And He's never late. His timing is precise and punctual. Right on. And this is why the psalmist said, "Be still in the presence of the Lord and wait patiently for Him to act." Don't worry about evil people who prosper and fret about their wicked schemes. Perfect. Thirdly, providence is sometimes obvious and extraordinary. Providence is sometimes obvious and extraordinary. Now, we often say, that's providential, and that's when we use that, when we're talking about something that's happened in our lives, we usually are saying that about something that has happened that's very striking to us. Maybe the timing of something. Something unusual, and it gets our attention, and we say that was providential. The truth is, brethren, everything is providential. Everything. Everything, all the events in life are providential. All the details. But we're often stopped in our tracks by what appears to be obvious. Something that occurs that really gets our attention, and we say, boy, that was providential. Well, in Esther, the great illustration of that was our reading in chapter 6 and 7. The greatest reversal of justice is recorded here, perhaps in all of human history. I mean, there's nothing like it. Haman is hung on he's impaled on that piece of wood that was intended for Mordecai. I mean, we sometimes say that was poetic justice, is what we're talking about. I mean, a complete reversal, very striking. And it illustrates something that's found in the Old Testament. The wicked dig a deep pit to trap others and then fall into it themselves. Now, this is exactly what happened. That's Psalm 7. Now, fourthly, providence exerts a secret influence that maintains human freedom. This is a very important point. Now, a lot can be said here on this point, just theologically, but remember the proverb, Proverbs 21:1. The king's heart, listen to this, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. And like the rivers of water, the Lord turns it in whatever direction He wants. Solomon's talking about a king here. He would refer to himself. A king, talk about somebody who has exercised a lot of free will, a lot of sovereignty, pretty much doing what they want. The will of a king. He says ultimately, the king's heart, his will, it's in God's hands, and God will turn it in any direction He wants. This is God's sovereign sway, even over the most free and sovereign of all human wills. You come to the end of the Bible, and there's a wonderful illustration of it in the book of Revelation, chapter 17, when it's talking about the kings, the 10 kings. And it says of these kings that God has put it in their hearts to carry out His purpose. Let me just ask the question. Why did King Xerxes want to decide to have that banquet? Why did King Xerxes decide to depose his queen from the kingdom? Why did King Xerxes decide not to honor Mordecai when he found out that Mordecai saved his life at the time the plot was uncovered? Just go through the story and ask that question. Why? Because God is working in the mind of this man. Now, did King Xerxes feel like there was some power over him and he could not resist and he lost his freedom? And absolutely not. He had perfect freedom to do what he wanted. But unbeknown to him, he was fulfilling the will of Yahweh and doing his bidding. Now, in conclusion, then, let me just make these remarks. God is still at work in the affairs of mankind. This is a story that's ancient, 2,500 years ago. Yahweh has not changed. The God of the Bible has not changed. He's still working in your life, in your family, in the church, in the nation, in the city. It doesn't matter. God is still at work behind the scenes, though invisible, most of the time, until it becomes obvious that His hand is being manifested in something. This is something that we just need to constantly remind ourselves of. God's hand is in everything, and everything is under His control. And never lose sight of that. That nothing occurs in the universe or in the universe of our little lives here apart from Him. Something else, an aspect of atheism. Now, I know there's no atheists here. I'm preaching to the choir. No, but you know something? There's an aspect of atheism that's very common, even among those who say, I believe in God. And Psalm 14 illustrates it. It's the outworking of acting like there is no God. Though I may say, I believe in God, I believe this about God, I believe He's at work. But practically, there's no prayer, there's no recognition of Him. Theologians of the past used to call this practical atheism. That is rampant today. Practical atheism. A failure to acknowledge God's government of the world. A failure to recognize divine providence. His intervention, His direction. And then finally, let me end on this note. All of the acts of God's providence are for the benefit of His people. Do you believe that? Think of it. All the things that God does in the world ultimately is for the benefit of His people. Is that an over-exaggeration? Listen to this. I'm going to give you Old Testament and New Testament. Old Testament, Psalm 25 and verse 10. All the paths of the Lord, all the paths of Yahweh are steadfast love and faithfulness for those who keep His covenant. All His paths, all His ways, ultimately are for His people that are in covenant with Him. Now, to get a little more fullness, then we go to Paul in Ephesians 1, speaking of the resurrected Christ, the authority that has been given to the risen Lord at the right hand of God. He exercises authority over all things, and this is what Paul says in Ephesians 1:22. God has put all things under His authority, under Christ, and made Him the head over all things. Now listen, for the benefit of the church. For the benefit of the church. He's head over all things for the benefit of the church. Everything God does is related ultimately to what He is doing and accomplishing on behalf of His people. That's how much He loves us. It's an amazing statement from Paul. So you as a child of God, and I hope you all are, you are the special object of God's loving providence. So what should we do in response to that? Well, trust it. Trust His providence. Submit to His providence. Study His providence. Learn all you can about divine providence. One of the most delightful subjects in the Bible. And give God the glory for every act of His providence.
Thank you for joining us and listening to this message from the Ministry of Grace Providence Church in Cerritos, California. For more information, visit our website at www.graceprovidencechurch.org.